All right, we're in the home stretch. Let's see, Austin back there. Could I have you read for us? And let's read the first 9 verses in chapter 1. We'll get started here. Yeah.
The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Generation goes and generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south, and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot bear. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, it's kind of a interesting beginning. I look at this first little section in chapter 1. It's like, hey, I've been to those places. You talk about where do you go for those. You know where you go for those inspirational moments. There was a place when I was in collegiate ministry, and when I was living up in Houghton, where they go boating and talk like from Finland, They go, let's go smelting, So, no, I've been watching the curling championships going on right now on the Apple TV app on ESPN. Curling, so it's Canada versus Quebec, and I love hearing the accents of those Canadians up there. But when I lived in the UP, if I needed to get away and get a little refresher, I'd go out to McLean State Park, driving through Houghton and across into Hancock and around up into Lake Superior, and there's this state park with this picnic table, and I'd sit there and I just look at the waves coming in, and it's just this scene. You see the reference here to where is it? Where did I see it? The sea is the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again, and it's repetition of what you observe. And you see it in the rising of the sun, and then the sun sets. And what does it do the next day? It rises, and then it sets. And, all of these things that we observe. And this common experience of the one who's seeking the question of meaning to life, not so much yet the moral meaning to life, they're whacked on the head with these scenes, these common scenes from looking up in the night sky and feeling really small and insignificant, looking at the vastness of a large expanse of water and feeling small and insignificant, asking the question, why am I here? It's that kind of thing. And he says there's nothing new under the sun. Good luck at, finding the meaning to life and sitting at the picnic table and contemplating your navel. No, I'm just kidding. It's just that idea. And he continues on here in verses, and you see this idea of vanity, this idea of emptiness there in verse 2. So in verses 12, he starts, I, the preacher, Koheleth, I've been king over Israel and Jerusalem. He's not mentioning himself by name. Critics of the theory of Solomon as author would say, well, the author here is not referring to Solomon. He could have just said Solomon, but he didn't. So is he, the argument against Solomon authorship, but might be hidden here, subtle. And I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that had been undone under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. And you start to hear a little bit of some of the critical cynicism come through. This is still a little bit of edginess to this book. We get into it. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is empty and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking can't be counted. I said to myself, behold, I've magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge, and I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realized that this is also striving after the wind. Wow. Because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Wow. Does that sound like Solomon? Maybe after a few of experiences that he had where wisdom got him, the continual pursuit of wisdom to the excess and outside of that covenantal context, merely for the pursuit of wisdom in and of itself led to this experience of futility. Maybe, in Solomon's experience. So then, after that, chapter 2, verses starting in verse 2 down through verse 10. Well, if that can't be done, I'll turn to something else. So he said to myself, come now, I'll test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. Hedonism. Humanism, right? And behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it's madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male, female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. Also, I possessed flocks and herds, larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. I collected for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers, and the pleasures of men, many concubines. Who's this sound like? Yeah? That's why I think there's a little bit of Solomon going on here. This sounds a lot like the evaluation that we read back in 1 Kings, right? But if we go all the way down to verse 24, we continue to see this futility after futility and pursuit after pursuit. Even the futility of labor. This is a hard one for the typical post-World War II generation working male who work all their life at a job and a career, and that defined who they were. And they struggle with that when they get to retirement age and don't know what to do with themselves. And the tragedy is sometimes they, I think, die way too prematurely because it's just, they give up and they haven't discovered the moral value to their life. They've based it on verses 18 through 23, I think. Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he'll have control over all of the fruit of my labor, for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil. Ooh, there's something to be said there. You have to be careful when you maybe have been gifted over the years of accumulating an amount of wealth, and how it goes after you're gone is part of the important decision making. We need to help our people and the wealthy people in our congregations make good choices. And ideally, right, the decision making with regards to what to do with the wealth after I'm gone, where does it go and what direction does it go, ought to line up with the definition of the moral value of their life. What were those things that they invested in? What might be the proper investment of that kind of wealth in terms of continuing on things that I'd be proud of from heaven's vantage point kind of thing? Unfortunately, some people get stuck in this, the futility of bickering children and maybe grandchildren and confusion, and nobody knows where the will is, and you've got the in my situation, this is real life and is really happening to me as I speak, the uncle who figured out a way to have all of grandma's money put in his name and all the accounts in his name, and somehow he has figured out a way to forget the 50-50 will between the Falls and the Smiths. And that's the pickle that we're in right now. Talk about greed. I mean, the moral thing to do is execute the will. It's simple. It defines the wishes of the deceased, and it defined the values with regards to where the money goes. Instead, there's this family confusion because of the greed of one who has figured out a way to do the legally right thing to do. That can be a mess. So I'm just saying, some of this is coming from a raw nerve. I'm sorry. I'll move on quickly. All right. Maybe I'll have to edit that out. I don't know. Okay. So, we see the chapter 3 is where we are now. What we get into, verse 24, there's nothing better for a man than to eat, to drink, and to tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that this is from the hand of God. We get into a little bit of edginess here, and you have to be careful about, what direction you go. Is this guy saying, the author here is saying, just give up on everything. You might as well just go out and enjoy yourself. I mean, there's really no point to it all. I mean, go out and party and do whatever you want. You've heard lots of different things, I'm sure, on this passage. No, I don't think he ever gives up the moral high ground on the thesis statement that we've read at the very end. We can't give up on. No, we're talking about one who fears the Lord. And sometimes what he does is in this book, Ecclesiastes, he pushes you to the edge as a means of tearing down the house that perhaps has been built. He pushes you to the edge of, well, I guess I am feeling a little bit of this futility. Maybe I am thinking a little bit of that way, So by tearing it down, he's going to build it up at the end. It's one of the strategies I think that he employs here. Chapter 3 is an interesting chapter. It focuses on, I think this is where I am. Yeah, verse 4. Let me see, I'm a little bit turned around here in my notes. Okay. So these 11 verses in chapter 3. So let's take a look at this and see. Tamara, could I have you read a little bit in chapter 3?
Start with 1.
Yes, ma'am.
There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves.
Okay, let's just pause there. I appreciate you reading that, but I got a little bit too ahead of myself. I want to, and it's not your fault, I wanted to remind ourselves of one thing before we leave this idea of Solomon as behind the authorship idea, I think. If we remind ourselves back in 1 Kings, let's turn there. We looked at this before, but I wanted to remind ourselves of this before I move on and grab this point. 1 Kings chapter 9. We saw the evaluation of Solomon in places like chapter 10, 1 Kings chapter 10, and the author there is going into the excesses of Solomon and his accumulation of gold and the multiplication of horses and the accumulation of women and how all of that combined led him down the path of turning from God, chapter 11 there, and the influence of these pagan women who came in and, the author screaming off the page, if we remember that negative evaluation of Solomon. And if we turn back a little bit before that, we remember and remind ourselves of the divine, I call it the divine reprimand, after the completion of the temple. which is really the high point of Solomon's application of wisdom. Chapter 9, verses 4 and 5. Even Solomon wasn't left off the hook with regards to this fearing the Lord and walking in obedience idea, even after receiving the gift of wisdom. You remember what the Lord says, chapter 9, verse 4. As for you, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if indeed your sons turn away or walk away from following me, and shall not keep my covenant, my commands, my statutes, which I set before you, and you shall go and serve other gods and worship them, then I'll cut off from Israel the land which I've given them. So wisdom does not get, or proper application of wisdom does not get Solomon off the hook of continuing to fear the Lord and walk in obedience. It's exactly the thesis statement. I think the parallel here is to how the book of Ecclesiastes ends on that same theme. So I think that's why we have a good, strong connection to Solomon in his experience of what happened. So that's what we have. So going back to the early chapter of Ecclesiastes, one of the things that I wanted to point out before we move on to chapter 3. Chapter 1, verse 13. Let's take a look at that. Verse 13, and this is another point I wanted to make, as it kind of relates to how we have always evaluated these kings. If you remember, by the heart, David was a man after God's own, so the evaluation of the heart. And we talked about the whole heart of King David and you might say the half heart of Solomon and the no heart of Saul in terms of the high, medium, and low, in terms of the evaluation of those for the first three kings of the United Kingdom. But here's what's interesting. I think there's a connection again to Solomon in this idea of the heart. Verse 13, and I set my, what's your translation say?
Heart.
Does it say heart? That's a good translation. Sometimes it says mind, right? The Hebrew words there is heart. I've set my heart to seek and explore wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. Again in verse 16, I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my, what's your translation say? It should say heart has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And then in verse 17, and I set my, should say heart to know wisdom and to make madness and folly. See, what's interesting is, for Solomon, here's what I think may have happened, and I'd have to, this is kind of in wet cement for me. But if we think of Solomon like this, in terms of, now he's maybe readily admitting, I set my heart to seek wisdom. And guess what that got in the way of? Yeah. This is the heart that should be seeking the Lord. This is the whole heart. This is the heart that loves and demonstrates loyalty and obedience and walks in obedience. What becomes a distraction for Solomon is that he admits right here, I set my heart to seek and explore wisdom. Maybe that was the distraction. I'd have to look at that a little bit more, but it just kind of struck me as I was looking at this text, the connection to the heart that we've been developing in terms of the idea of fearing the Lord and walking in obedience and all of the things that get in the way of this whole heart that David had, even though warts and all. But we see that wisdom came in and maybe robbed him of the whole heart that David before him had. So that's what I wanted to point out there. And we have the reminder from Moses. We go back to Deuteronomy chapter 4. In terms of, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. That's what comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. So that's what I think there. So we see other misapplications of Solomon's wisdom. We saw in chapter 2, verse 3, the stimulation of one's body. That's hedonism, pleasures, and seeking the pleasures of life. He set his heart in verses 4 through 10, as we saw, to the experience of things. verses 16 through 17, he gives a real honest admission, I think, in chapter 2. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after the wind. It gets kind of edgy, doesn't it? But again, I think his strategy is he's kind of tearing down kind of this, whatever he's observing in the kingdom, these false houses of promise, things where people go to, I'll just go to that house or that place or that location, and I'll experience some aspect of meaning to my life and be distracted for a while. And then when that's over and dull and boring, I'll go over to this house and another thing I'll try and another thing I'll try. And we had our list, we came up with our list as a class as well. So I don't want to spend any time on this. This is just for fun. I'm giving this to you as an example of what could be done if you're a youth pastor and you've got some creative students in your class. I did this with the college group that I was teaching. We were covering the book of Ecclesiastes, and I gave them a challenge, an extra credit assignment, and a student named Van Komatsu came up with a spoken word rap on the book of Ecclesiastes. So you have it in your PowerPoint slide set. I'm giving you all of these PowerPoints, as you know, in each weekly folder. So you have this. I'll just play you a sample. I don't want to play the whole thing. He produced this whole thing. It's kind of cool. If you've seen him, if you remember him. Some of these are college students that have graduated, so.
Under the sun, I've had bundles of funds. Stacking silver to the sky, I've had bundles of funds. I've had hundreds of honeys into numerous sums. And drug in my tummy, so the food was a ton. No function could sully or ruin my gun. My government money was second to none. But the extraordinary was exceeding the heights. All the kings of the earth came to seek my guidance. If anyone said they were greater, you can catch me on the latest version of Jerusalem Trip. A passion for snatching, to fly is fashion. My action consisted of grasping the cash and then flashing. I was sipping a tea, living a dream, swimming in cream, brimming with greed, singing the stream. The quintessential player, slick, suave, and savvy, who else had 1,000 women who were calling him daddy. The enemy of the coming here to speakers. Listen to me, children. I'm exposing my weakness. My goal is to work them. My goal is to teach them. To come here and listen to the words of the preacher. Got my status.
All right, enough of that. So you get the idea. It kind of goes on if you want to listen to it on your own, or if you need a little study break for your final exam, or midterm exam, you can watch this whole thing. All the words to it are right here. He's put a lot of words down, but it's spoken word rap. But you can see it's like in that logical relationship of ideas. Interestingly, a lot like what we've looked at in Hebrew parallelism, vanity of vanities coming through the speakers. Listen to me, children. I'm exposing my weakness. My goal is to warn you. My goal is to teach you. So come here to listen to the words of the preacher. It's kind of cool. He did a really good job. So don't underestimate your creative youth kids out there who love to do this stuff, and they're probably better at it than you are in terms of the technology. Turn them loose on something like this. All right, so you read... we had Tamara read chapter 3. Now we're back to chapter 3. And you see, chapter 3 is an interesting little interlude focusing on the futility of time. Time is an interesting theme that comes into the book of Ecclesiastes. Earlier in chapter 1, we see the rising, everything in between, the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. Passing of time, right? 24-hour day, tomorrow. Oh, another 24-hour day, tomorrow. Another 24-hour day. Or water going down a river, filling the ocean never fills up. What's happening? Where's this water going, And what's my role in this? If water knows what it's doing, but what am I doing, And night sky or looking out at the vastness of the ocean. Here's another, just to show you that time is one of these things that people reflect on. This is a modern day poem. Taking away the moments that make up a dull day. Fritter and waste the hours in an offhand way. Kicking around a piece of ground in your hometown, waiting for someone or something to show you the way? Tired of lying in the sunshine, staying home to watch the rain? You are young and your life is long, and there is time to kill today. And then one day you find 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run. You missed the starting gun. You all know who this is, don't you? Pink Floyd. Yeah. Who would ever thought you'd hear Pink Floyd in an Old Testament survey class? But yeah, time has been something for a long time in the history of humanity. It's been is part of this Ecclesiastes experience. There's this futility of time and the events that come under heaven, and the activities. And interestingly, according to what Tamara read in chapter 3, we see this appropriateness. We experience the appropriateness of things in their time, right? A time to give birth and a time to die. Plant, a time to uproot what's planted. A time to mourn, a time to dance. A time to throw stones, a time to gather stones. A time to embrace, a time to shun embracing. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. And then he says in verse 9, what profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men, with which they occupy themselves. There's this, it comes back to futility. I see the appropriateness of everything going on around me from this extreme to this extreme, and somehow I'm caught in between. I'm caught in between the two extremes. You know, there's futility there. Unless you have this foundation of navigational ability, not like this, not like Solomon, but this whole heart and this fear of the Lord. But here he kind of explains himself here. I'm looking at now, starting in verse 11 in chapter 3. He kind of gives a little bit of a theological insider information. You see, I love this passage. He made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in the heart, in their heart. Yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Yeah, ask anybody on the street. They'll be honest. Even in the midst of their futility cloud, they'll come out of the cloud and say, you know, I really do sense that there's something more out there. You know, that seems like it's a common experience. I sense in my heart of hearts that there's got to be more to life. You know, probably death isn't the end, and you know, I kind of don't believe that nihilistic thing, and kind of think that maybe there's more to my life that I'm currently experiencing, and something to that. I just kind of know it intuitively. I don't know why. Could you please explain to me why I might be feeling that way? Well, the author of Ecclesiastes does. And that's what he says in verse 11. The backdrop. So the experience, it seems to be hardwired into the experience. So the vastness of space and the minuteness now that we can look under the microscope and see the smallness of things, and we're kind of in between, and kind of this experience of where do I fit into, you know, the things that are going on around me all the time, and it's this struggle with time. It's that inner voice that says, you know, there's eternity. That's real. It's not imaginary. Chapter 3, verses 12 through 15, he continues on. He says, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. This is a gift of God. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take away from it, for God has so worked that men should fear him. There you go. He's coming back kind of with a little theological reprise. You know, he's pausing and saying, all right, I've been a little rough on you. Now let me kind of fill in a little bit of the blank here. Let's come back to this fear of God idea. That which has already been, that which has been already, and that which will be has already been, for God seeks what has passed by. You know, kind of what he's saying there in verses 12 through 15. Everything I do is bound by my lifetime from beginning to end. So I'd better enjoy life or enjoy it while I have it. Verses 12 through 13. But is there more? Verse 14a, he just says, but God remains forever. That's a given. And verse 14b, he says, can I do anything to add or to take away from that? No, the answer is no. And he concludes, verse 14c, God's system, God's design pushes men to fear him. I think he admits that there in that chapter. There's this hard wiring in the fabric of creation and God's good creation that pushes humanity, because they're hardwired that way, towards this, futility that direction, but in the opposite direction. If this experience gets their attention, they're going to turn around and go back the other right and proper direction, and that's to establish this orientation of fearing the Lord in their life. Blaise Pascal was a French philosopher, and is he also a physicist? Mathematician, that's right. There is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man which cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God, the Creator, made known through Jesus. So he was a Christian mathematician and thinker, great thinker of antiquity. So I think in chapter 3, verse 14, we read, I think Solomon here is recognizing the more value of life. Life's essential meaning is weighed on the scale of eternity. The futility comes from this eternity, but also its value and the idea of its essential meaning also comes from that eternal weight. Our fear of the Lord sets us in proper orientation. Again, so even in the midst of this immovable sense of time, meaning can come from this sense of eternity. And if man's not properly oriented that way, there's going to be a path of futility. So a lot of philosophies will wrestle with this and try to come up with some kind of solution, and maybe all paths lead to the same end. All right. The discussion of, I'll just maybe throw in a little bit here, the discussion on authorship, the critical observations. Sometimes they'll talk about the language that's used in the book seems to fit a date that might fit more of the 3rd century BC. There's an observation that the Aramaic language had an influence on this book, perhaps. Maybe even some scholars have said, well, this book was produced from those Jews who fled the Babylonian exile and went down to Egypt. So they're producing this kind of wisdom material down there. I don't know. I don't get into that much, but there's critical scholars, and they go different directions with regards to authorship for various reasons. I think we've got some good textual in the text evidence to suggest a strong chord to Solomon, and he himself is helping, either authoring himself or supervising the one who's putting this all down with regards to this evaluation of his wisdom and his misapplication of wisdom. So that's what I think on that. Let's keep going here and we'll finish. Oh, we're almost done. Move over to Ecclesiastes chapter 6. We get into some more edgy evaluation, and probably what I need to do is save this for not next week, but the week after when we come back from spring break. I've been good to you, just to let you know. No assignments are due during the week of spring break, so you can use that to catch up. Make sure you're mindful of the window for the midterm. Starts now. It started last night at midnight and continues to midnight next Sunday. So you've got that window to kick out the midterm. There's a study guide in the midterm tab. Now you'll see the study guide as well as the link to the test. So when you're ready to take the test, you can click in. Carve out yourself 2 full hours. You may not need it, but you can take it if you need it. 3 essays, A, B, and C. You do one of A and B. You only have to select one. And then everybody has to do C, essay C. Okay? Fair enough? All right. Thanks for your attention today.